In our previous segment, we heard about the often lesser discussed refugee crisis of the 1940s, the Jewish refugees who were forced out of their Middle Eastern homes through violence and sanctions. We now look into the Palestinian refugees that we hear about all the time in the news. In the mid-1940s, the Arab Muslim population for British Mandate for Palestine was about 1 million. For the record, these were Arabs of various backgrounds living in Palestine, some for a number of years and others for many generations. These Arabs lived for many years under the British Empire and before that, the Ottoman Turks. In 1948, the War of Independence begins, and the newly created Arab states and the Arab League attack the day-old state of Israel. Their self-stated claim was to destroy the small Jewish state, and their secondary goal was to create a unified state for the Palestinians. As is the case in war, civilians who are caught in the middle of these warring armies have two choices. They can stay and hope to remain safe, or leave for safer grounds. This was the choice that many Arabs and Jews had in the area. Many Jewish civilians chose to stay and fight for the survival of their state and in many cases their own lives. Arab civilians who had on their side highly trained and highly equipped armies fighting on their behalf may have not felt as much of a call to stand up and fight against an army. So many of them chose to leave their homes for safety of the neighboring Arab nations, temporarily. There is some documentation of Israeli army units asking local Arab populations to leave their homes. This could be for ideological reasons, asking them to leave because they wanted them out, or maybe for the Arab family's safety. Many of the Arab nations asked the local population to prepare to return home once they had ended the war with the Jewish state. Many of these 750,000 Arab refugees were funneled into various Arab countries in the neighboring areas. Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, which included what is now known as the West Bank, and the Egyptian territory of Gaza. Since the Arab nations expected to destroy Israel, they set up temporary camps for these Arab refugees within their territory. Miraculously, the Arab nations lost the war against Israel, and Israel survived. Meanwhile, as the Israelis are accepting Jewish refugees from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the Arab nations tell the refugees in the camps to hold on until a future war can happen, and the Israeli state can be destroyed, at which point they'll be able to return to their homes in what is now Israel. While the Palestinian Arabs are now residing in a foreign country, they are not welcomed with open arms. Many Arab states choose to consider the refugees as, quote, stateless people, and do not provide the full citizenship or even much support to these Palestinian Arab refugees. When it becomes obvious that the Jewish state would not be wiped off the earth, policies of the Arab nations towards the refugees changed. The Arab nations' initial sympathy was coupled with the insistence on Israel's ultimate responsibility for them. As a result, most Arab governments strongly opposed the resettlement and naturalization of the refugees. Instead, they adopted policies and procedures aimed at preserving the Palestinian identity and their status as refugees. As the Arab nations maintained the refugee population in refugee camps and refused to absorb them into their own populations, they still had the ability and control over Gaza and the West Bank. They had every opportunity to create a Palestinian state in the areas that they controlled, but they never did. Was this because the Palestinian people didn't really want a partial state? It was sort of an all or nothing? Or was this because the Arab nations didn't care enough to give them the state that they promised? Was it maybe better to continue to use their plight as a reason for a future war against Israel? This essentially was the hope by the Arab armies in 1967, when the Arab nations once again attacked the Israeli state. Again, miraculously, the Israelis not only fought back against these armies, but gained more ground, taking over the land of West Bank and Gaza. This included many of the refugee camps that were initially created under the control of the Jordanians and the Egyptians. In subsequent peace talks between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, Israel gave back land for peace and wanted to give back the West Bank and Gaza to their former countries. This included their refugee camps of the Palestinians. By now, the Palestinian Arab populations in Gaza and the West Bank became a thorn in the side of the Arab nations. For example, in the 1970s, the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, attempted to assassinate the King of Jordan, twice. The Arab countries were happy to see the Israeli state get stuck having to maintain this difficult population of revolutionaries and desperate civilians, who under the Arab nations had been kept in poor conditions in refugee camps with no chance of a life for over 30 years. When we come back, we will look into the refugee camps today, who controls them, and their Palestinian residents. We'll be right back after this on the Jewish Diaspora Report.